Hi, this is David Parra here again with another topic, or not another topic, the same topic as last time, but another episode. This is a series, a series on long-term care. And with me today, again, one more time, thank you so much for doing a back-to-back show. Reagan Smith, Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Director with the Area Agency on Aging Region 1. Reagan, thank you so very much. I know we're all busy, but you were willing to join our show again. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And just to whet the appetite, our next show is going to be on the Ombudsman program. So anybody listening to this show, you won't want to miss that program. It'll be the next show, number 11, on the Ombudsman program, a very important program. So don't miss that. Let me review, Reagan, if you don't mind, just very briefly what we have covered, especially last time. And then we're going to get to, because we are covering, and let me show the slide here, we are covering how to pay for long-term care and Medicaid access, and more specifically, ALTCS is the program in Arizona that pays for long-term care. Obviously, you have to apply and you have to qualify. So let me run down the slides real fast. We know that we're talking about this range of services and supports that help people with activities of daily living. This is long-term care. Also, we sometimes refer to as caregiving. That's what we mean. It obviously includes instrumental activities of daily living. This can happen at home. Most of it, I might add, 80% of it happens at home. It could be by an unpaid caregiver or a paid one. Community support services, we also did a show on that. And obviously, there's also the option of outside the home. How to pay for that? Well, it involves Medicare, regular insurance to some degree, long-term care insurance, public programs. We already covered that. And now we are on the Medicaid program, which in Arizona is access, but the specific program that pays for long-term care is ALTCS. And we did a show last week and we covered some of the requirements. You explained to us, Reagan, the program. Then we also talked about what the general requirements. We also, you also explained to us that it's critical that a person meets the medical requirements, because you could meet all the income and the general, but this is key. If you don't meet the medical requirements, you will not be approved. And then we also started, or actually did a pretty good job in covering the income requirements. And I just wanted to ask you to I guess repeat, review again, Reagan, that the applicant cannot have more than $2,382 of monthly gross income. But there's always ways, correct, to spend down that money. Can you just briefly talk about how that money can be spent down to qualify, including the income-only trust?
So when we talk about spending down, we're really talking about the assets, because people can't have more than $2,000 in countable assets, not including a house and a car. So that's different than the gross income, where the income limit is $2,382 a month. But as we talked about last time, there is the option to set up an income-only trust if someone does have income higher than that. We talked about how Access has to have that line in the sand somewhere. So that's their line, but certainly that's not enough to pay for nursing home care. So there is that option to set up an income-only trust. Being careful before jumping through all those hoops that this person qualifies medically, before they jump through the hoops of setting up a trust, which they might need an attorney or a specialist in ALTCS to set that up, which if people have questions about that, need resources, they can call the senior helpline with the Area Agency on Aging, and we can give them resources for that.
And in this point that we have here, Regan, we show that Miller Trust must contain a clause stating that upon the death of the beneficiary, any funds remaining must be paid to Access up to the amount ALTCS paid for services on behalf of the person. This is why it's so critical that anytime you're doing this maneuvers, if you will, you have to be informed before making this very, very important decision. So now let's move, Regan, to the point that for this show, number 2 on this particular topic, and this is the assets requirements. So obviously, income is money coming in from different sources, but assets is things that you have which could be converted into money, correct? What are those assets that are typically considered?
Sure. They are looking at your assets, including not your income, but what you have in your checking account, savings account, credit union accounts, 401ks, any assets that are out there. That's what they look at to determine if you have assets that you could use to pay for your care. Because, like we talked about last time, ALTCS is a payer of last resort. So if you have more than 2,000 in countable resources, they want that used for your care.
And I think an important point that I believe that comes to people's minds when they're talking about soliciting, applying for long-term care is, how about my house? Because you say it's of a payment of last resort. That means, in essence, you're supposed to spend your money on your care, and then when you are when you have depleted your assets and what have you, then the state comes in. But in this case, the state doesn't require you to do that, especially when it comes to your house. And I have a line here that there is a possibility of the equity of a home exceeding the state home equity limit. So so just because a house, if you only have your own house, I mean the house you live in, we're not talking about other investment house or rental houses. Even the equity of a home could potentially play into the qualification here, or qualifying for the services.
Right. A lot of people don't apply for ALTCS because they're worried about their home. This is my home, and I don't want my home to be taken. Is what I hear. But you're allowed to keep your home, particularly if you're living in your home, because you can get care through the ALTCS program in your home, and the
Right.
goal is to keep people at home if that's possible. So people are allowed to keep a home. They're allowed to keep one car, but keeping in mind it's only one home. And the goal is that you're still living in that home or have intent to return to that home. So that's important to keep in mind.
And we'll get into this a little bit deeper, I believe, but can you also make some comments about specifically if you have a spouse living there and children, there's definitely going to be a protection for them, correct?
Correct. So if you are an individual applying for the program and you already live in a long-term care facility or in that home, and you have a spouse or a child under age 21 or a child who is blind or has a disability living in that home, the house stays. And the spouse or this adult child with a disability or a child under 21 gets to keep that house. So you're referring to the estate recovery program a little, right. Which people get very concerned about. And it's a reason that people don't apply because they're concerned. And it's because they don't necessarily know the parameters. I don't want ALTCS to take my house.
Right.
ALTCS isn't taking the house. And it's a lien after the ALTCS member passes to recoup what's been paid for that person's care if there's not a spouse and if there's not a surviving child who has a disability or is under age 21. So
and we'll cover some of those details just a bit later, but I think it was very important to put it out there because it is a concern. So let's move on with the assets requirement here. Sure. What assets not considered? What would those be?
So the house, like we were just talking about, a person's car. A person is allowed to keep a car, particularly if they're still using it. They're living in that house and they need the car. The spouse needs the car. Household belongings are not considered. The burial policy that's set up in advance, that life insurance with the face value of under $1,500, which is often used for that burial plan. So it's just important to keep those things in mind, that you're allowed to have those assets that are not considered.
Okay, so we're talking about assets, and now we come to a point where it says that you can only have $2,000 in your account. So where are those assets, or how do they relate to this $2,000? On the one hand, I can only have 2,000, but then we're talking about this other asset. So is there also a way to calculate the assets? Is there a limit about the assets? Is there an assets limit? Let me put it that way.
Right. So for the person who's applying, the individual applying for the program, not including their income, the $2,382, just what's in that checking account or savings account, or their 401k, all of those together can't be over the 2,000 limit. Keeping in mind, so I like to say this every time, people should be very wary of just spending down if they're not going to qualify medically. That's always the hinge. Be really careful about what you do with your money if you aren't going to qualify medically. It's always something to look at and is a concern. Because again, like what I said last time, these people move into these assisted living facilities and they're told, well, you just spend down your money here, and then in a year you can apply for ALTCS. And it doesn't always work out that way.
That's why the Ombudsman program is so critical, and we'll talk about it in our next show, because you need an advocate. You need somebody who understands these things and is able to provide a fuller picture of the whole situation. Let's move on now to the next point, and to me, this is a very, very important point. So let me paint two scenarios, one briefly, and the other one I would like you to explain it in a deeper fashion. So if someone's a single person and they pass the income test, then the house thing, there's nobody in the house, potentially that there may be a lien placed on that. Is this correct? On a person who is a single person?
Correct, the estate recovery program, but keeping in mind that is upon the ALTCS member's passing. So this is after death, to try to recoup what has been paid for that person's care, remembering that access is the payer of last resort.
So now let's go to the second scenario. And there is, I perceive it to be, in my research about this matter, is that there is a strong, I guess, concept argument for the spouse not to be placed in an impoverishment situation. Can you help us understand this concept?
Yes. So I tell people to just apply for ALTCS, to see if they can take a snapshot of your income and assets to determine if the individual that needs to apply, that needs the long-term care, will qualify. The goal is to not impoverish a spouse who continues to live in the community, not needing long-term care services. So if that person is not applying, they get to keep potentially a chunk of the assets. So it's important for that couple to start the application to see what of the assets the spouse gets to keep.
Now, is there like limits, numbers that you can at least give us an idea in terms of assets that are calculated, divided by 2? I read some information on that.
Yes. So again, it's important for people to qualify, to apply, to see if they qualify, get that snapshot. I don't want to scare anybody off if they think they shouldn't qualify or that's not the program for me, because there's so many factors that go into it. ALTCS has a formula, of course, that they use to determine this. where they total the couple's assets and divide by 2 to determine what the individual who's applying needs to spend down on his care or her care, if any, and then the rest to determine what portion the spouse keeps. So there's the minimum, if it's less than $26,000, and then the maximum spousal share of more than $130,000. So ALTCS uses this formula to determine what the spouse gets to keep and what the individual who's applying for the program spends down, if any. So there are situations where the spouse keeps the total assets. So
I like this because they for some programs they kind of lump the couple together, but for this one they seem to be very mindful of. And I would like us to mention here that we have what is called institutionalized spouse and community spouse. I think it's the term, it's very clear that
Right.
community spouse is the person who still is in the community, most likely in the home. And
Right.
then the institutionalized spouse, it's the person or the spouse receiving the care, most likely in a nursing facility, so to speak. Okay. So yeah, this is really good information. I really like it. And you also mentioned that even if kids younger than 21 are in the house, they are also mindful of them as well. These programs are, correct?
Correct. And then
Okay.
talking, I don't know if you want to talk about the income at all for the spouse, but that's also part of the calculation that ALTCS uses to determine that spouse who's living in the community may get to keep some of the individual's income who's living in the facility. Typically, there's a share of cost that ALTCS determines for that individual who's living in the facility based on that person's income. But if there's a spouse living in the community, that spouse could get to keep a portion of the income for their expenses, depending on what the income is.
Not only income, or not only assets, but also income.
Correct.
This is really good. And I really like the spirit of these rules, right? It's to protect the spouse, the community spouse. This is really, really, really good. Let's move on. Let's see what else we have here. I think you just covered that it is possible also for the community spouse to keep not only the assets, the majority of it, but it's even some of the institutionalized spouses' income.
Correct.
Perfect. Let's move on now to the share of costs. What is this all about? Does this mean that even when you qualify for ALTCS, there may be some cost sharing?
Correct. As I alluded to just a second ago, again, keeping in mind, ALTCS is the payer of last resort. So if you have income and you don't have a spouse in the community who might get some of that income, ALTCS determines what you pay towards your care based on your income. You get to keep a portion of your income for personal needs, which is, I think it's around $119 a month that you get to keep of your income, which you use for personal needs, clothes, snacks, things that aren't provided at the facility that you might want, special haircuts, going out for dinner, those types of things that aren't covered by the facility. So
perfect. Yeah, this is basically the same point. So let's move on. So now let's just review, because I think you already covered this. Medicaid estate recovery. This is by law, isn't it?
Yes, this is a law for individuals who are 55 and older who are enrolled in ALTCS for the state to recoup what they've paid towards that person's care after that person dies. That's where the lien comes in. So people worry that this is while they're still alive, that ALTCS is going to come and take my home. And that's not the case. So it's to recoup, for the state to recoup what has been paid towards that person's care if there's a house still out there and the state just paid for that person's care until they passed away. Unless, of course, there's a spouse or
Right.
the child with a disability or a child under the age 21 living in that home. And there are probably other exemptions, and that's why it's important to just apply. And ALTCS will go through this all with the applicant. It's just important to be educated and start that application. Even if the application isn't accepted the first time, you know what needs to be done.
Is there a scenario where an institutionalized spouse, um, what is the word here, passes the assets to another person through some means, trust or what have you? Is there scenarios like that? And what is the warning, if I could use that word, not to do it in just a without being really informed of what that potentially could do to the application decision?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a transfer. So
That's right.
people are not allowed to just, they call it a transfer, but really it's
Mhm.
give away
Mm,
assets like your house, money in your bank account. You can't just give it away
right.
because it could be used towards your care.
Mm,
So if ALTCS looks back 5 years to see if a house has been transferred or assets to another individual, because that could have been used to pay for care.
mhm,
So if ALTCS finds that, if Access finds that during the application, that person would be ineligible potentially for the amount of that transfer. So let's just say, for example, that this person gave their house away, transferred the
mhm.
title to another family member, and then they apply for ALTCS. So if the house was worth $150,000, they divide that by, let's say, $5,000 a month is
Mhm.
what the care would cost. So that person could be ineligible for close to 3 years
Mm.
because of that transfer, and that because that asset could have been used to pay for the person's care. So that's Access thinking on that. That's the guideline, because again, payer of last resort. So
Right. Another question. So let's say that a community spouse is there, and they can't recover any money for services, Altec services provided. Is there still the possibility that when the community spouse passes away, that there is some kind of a recovery there from the government?
I don't think so, but I think that's a good question that people could ask when they apply for the
Okay.
program. Again, we don't want these rules to be reasons that people don't apply and ask those questions or talk to an elder law attorney or an ALTCS application specialist about those little nuances because it's important to apply.
Perfect.
It's my understanding that the lien would be when there's not a spouse living in the house after the individual passes. So
Perfect.
usually there's not a spouse involved at all in those situations.
So now let's go to our last point, and that is applying. Obviously, the one thing here that we need to understand is when somebody's going through this kind of needs, in many instances, they it is prefer and most likely needed to assign a person. Obviously, that is doable. It could be a friend, a family member, an attorney. Obviously, that person needs to be very familiar, right, with the situation and be able to answer questions.
Correct.
Is this something common that happens when somebody assigns or designates another person to take care of these matters?
Sure. Another person can act on the individual's behalf to follow through on the application. ALTCS allows that. It's encouraged. Oftentimes, the applicant isn't able to apply on their own. So, if a family member or a
Hmm.
friend can do it, that's encouraged.
And obviously, there's some situations where the person is no longer able to designate a person. So that's a whole different process that is going to go through, that is going to have to happen to literally find out the person who is going to act on that person's behalf, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's see. And obviously, you can apply at ArizonaAccess.gov, or you can call toll free 888-621-6880. This is the official number, so to speak. So no one should disqualify themselves. And like Regan Smith, our special guest today, has been repeating it. Just do go through the application process. It is extremely important. Let's see, what else do, go ahead.
And just to jump in there, it's really easy to call that number and apply.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take much. You need the individual's name, of course, their address, date of birth, social security number, to start the application over the phone. Then it's assigned to an eligibility worker who scheduled a telephone interview to do the financial side. And then they typically, once that's all approved, they schedule the medical assessment. So it usually takes minimum of 45 days, but it can take longer.
Right. Another thing that we want people to know is that if the application is denied, they are always able to appeal that. And there's this matter of a review your eligibility status every year. I believe that's kind of like the same concept with acute care plans from the ACCESS program, correct?
Correct. They want to make sure that you still qualify medically and financially. And they do require that if there's a change during the year, particularly income assets, that's reported right away to ACCESS.
Of course. Excuse me. Okay, so let us conclude the show. I am very thankful to Regan Smith. Regan Smith is Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Director with the Area Agency on Aging Region 1. Just any final thoughts that you want to add, Regan, before we conclude?
Sure. Thanks again for having me. And if anyone has questions at all, feel free to call our agency, call this our senior helpline. You can ask questions, get connected to the Ombudsman program, which of course we'll talk more about next week.
Perfect. Thank you, Regan Smith, again, Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Director with the Area Agencies on Aging Region 1. Thank you so very much, Regan, and see you next time.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right. And thank you all. And we really ask you to share the show with your friends. I hope that this information was very valuable. Take care of yourselves and see you next time.